Welcome into another Monday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Hope you enjoyed the bye week. If you're an Indiana football fan, if you're not an Indiana football fan, hopefully you enjoyed whatever it is you consume, whether it be other college football games, maybe some NFL action, maybe you didn't watch sports at all. In that case, I'd probably question why you're even checked into the show in the first place. But, we welcome all people. If you're not a sports fan and you're here for the nonsense that we sometimes get into, or at least I appreciate that as well. But welcome in. Happy Monday. It is officially Indiana-Nebraska week. We're finally jumping into, after a week off, the back half of the Indiana football schedule. And some say, and I would agree with this notion, that this is where the season kind of gets real. And not that anything that happened prior to this coming week is irrelevant, but now that we've seen the dominoes fall, we now kind of know where this Indiana team stands, at least in terms of their identity and maybe in comparison with some of the rest of the conference. Not all of it, of course, but with the teams they've already played. This is where they have a chance to kick it up a notch and really prove, especially on a national scale, what they're really made of. Do they really belong at the top or towards the top? Do all these conversations about potentially making the college football playoff, were they worth our time during the first half of the season? And all of that begins this Saturday when the Fighting Corn Cobs of Nebraska, the Nebraska Cornhuskers to be exact, they make their way to Bloomington for a big noon kickoff clash on Fox. And yes, that is some good stuff there with big noon coming to town to Bloomington, I believe for the first time ever. I know Indiana hosted College Game Day in a very weird format during the beginning of the Tom Allen era. It was the first College Game Day of the season, and it was on a Thursday, but it also wasn't your typical College Game Day. I believe the way they had it set up, there weren't any like fans, and it was very kind of weird to watch. And Indiana was playing Ohio State, and I believe the game was fairly close for a while before Ohio State, of course, hit the gas pedal and put Indiana fans out of their misery at some point during the fourth quarter, as they usually have done. But you got big noon coming in, Fox's iteration of College Game Day, and it's a good product. I mean, I'm looking forward to checking out what it looks like from the TV perspective, because I will unfortunately not be able to attend the Indiana-Nebraska game, as I believe I mentioned last week when they announced the times, because I also have to cover some duties for Louisville Cardinals football then. Because they both play at noon, I unfortunately cannot make my way up to Bloomington, which my goal is to make it up to Bloomington for a home game at least once. Especially, I know, you hear Mitchell talking about this being a season that just feels like magic, and we're going to talk with Mitchell Paige, as we usually do on a Monday, here in a bit. But it would be a shame if I cannot make it up to Bloomington for at least one home game whenever this team is having the season that they have, especially if it continues to, bleed into the second half of the schedule, as we hope it does. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and I'm very excited to talk all things, Indiana football. We'll talk a little Indiana basketball this week too. Hoosier Hysteria is Friday. It's a big week in Bloomington in general, and I know I've repeated this multiple times, but it is worth mentioning again, just because the scenario that was laid out early on before the season even took place, whenever we recorded our Indiana football preview with Kyler Staley and Drew Rosenberg on talking about the Hoosiers. We mentioned the prospects of not only having an unbeaten Indiana football team coming into, off of the bye week, facing a Nebraska team. You got big noon kickoff now, but that also comes on, the heels of the opening of basketball season, the unofficial start to basketball season around here, which is Hoosier Hysteria. And it's a big weekend for recruits, of course, that we talked about. And it's kind of, the hype train for the basketball season really gets going once you see all the festivities that take place during Hoosier Hysteria. And we'll detail some of those later on in the show. That there may be a few things worth mentioning. I know they put some stuff out last week. And I'll go over. What I'll do is, you all know how this show works. During the Mitchell Paige segment, when I pause this here, as I let you in on my little world and how this kind of production takes place sometimes, I'll take a look at some of it. And if it's worth going over, then I will. And I'll definitely mention a few things because people want to know time and that type of stuff. And yeah, you can look up those types of things on your own. Maybe there'll be some interesting little tidbits in there that we can talk about as well. And we're also not far away from the charity scrimmage shortly after the Hoosier Hysteria that will take place this weekend. So a lot of very close to crossover season, as I've alluded to again for a while. And that's where the grind really gets real. And it's fun. It's fun, especially if the teams that you're covering are good and winning. And especially if you're a fan of the team, because some people in this business either can't be a fan, and that's totally understandable if you can't, or some can, and they prefer not to say they're a fan for whatever reason. And again, to each their own. I don't want to sit there and tell people how to do, how to be however they want, do their job, whatever it may be. But for those who know me, I do feel like I provide a fairly objective perspective. I know I am a fan of Indiana, but at the same time, I do feel like I do offer usually a pretty good perspective when it comes to being realistic about things. And again, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on that type of stuff right now, but where do we go from here? How about this? I know I like to brag about my gambling picks whenever they hit, right? Well, it was not a good week for me on the gambling side of things. And if you tailed me on any of the bets for the In Touch with Indiana Sports parlay this past weekend, well, I unfortunately let you down. And it is with my utmost apologies, right, that hopefully we can get back on the right track this week. And for those who just want to be reminded of the failure, we took USC money line. That was one that did not hit. And that was one of the closer ones of the three between the parlay that very well could have hit if it weren't for Penn State getting it done in overtime. We took Rutgers to cover against Wisconsin. That ended up being way wrong. One thing I failed to consider with Wisconsin whenever I was putting together that parlay is how well they did against Purdue the week before. And I think what I did is I just saw that result and said, well, it's Purdue. They only put up that many points because they were facing Purdue. And I didn't think they would do the same against Rutgers, especially on the road. But I was wrong about that one. So Rutgers let me down. And the last one we took Minnesota. I think it was the time. I can't remember what it was whenever I took. I think it was maybe -4.5. Well, guess what? They only won by 4 on the road at UCLA. So 0 for 3 on the parlay. That's unfortunate. But we did hit WKU back on Thursday. So we can't win them all. And then I made a straight bet in the NFL yesterday. I bet the over in Cincinnati versus New York, and that ended up not coming anywhere near close as well, unfortunately. But oh well, got to move on. You win some, you lose some. That's how it works in this betting business, right? And not that I'm in the business of it. I just have fun with a little gambling now and again. Put a little stake in the game, makes it a little more exciting for the games otherwise you normally wouldn't care about. But we'll put together another parlay this week, and maybe we'll bounce back. The pattern has typically been so far, I think it's still kind of along these same lines. Maybe it's not exactly the same, but we usually hit one and we lose one. We hit one, we lose one. But if I'm not mistaken, I feel like we missed by one leg in the previous week too. So it's okay, though. We'll bounce back. What else? Before we bring on Mitchell, I'd like to get through some of these quick hitters. I already mentioned big noon kickoff. We'll talk Hoosier Hysteria here in a little bit. We got to sell out at Memorial Stadium for the the matchup this weekend, and I really hope a lot of that doesn't include a takeover from Nebraska. I don't think that will be the case. There'll of course be plenty of Nebraska fans in attendance, considering they do kind of pop up all over the place. and they are a well-traveled fan base when it comes to football, of course. And there will be some there, I'm sure. But I'm excited to see what a full Memorial Stadium looks like, especially with all the red. It does help aesthetically whenever you have two red teams playing and you have a sellout. It may be the annual photo op for, you know, the campus and stuff like that. They want to get a sold out Memorial Stadium for the next year's promotional photos and that type of stuff. So that'll be a good sight to see. And I'm really just looking forward to seeing what the environment in general looks like in Bloomington this Saturday. And hopefully we have a lot to cheer about, because this is the beginning of the back half of that people see is a lot tougher. But at the same time, it's not like it's not manageable, right? I mean, you're going to hear Mitchell and I talk here in a little bit about just what we think of Nebraska, so I'm not going to spoil any of that conversation, but there's no reason that if Indiana continues to execute at the level in which they have so far, there's no reason that they shouldn't be able to get it done in another convincing fashion against Nebraska. And then if we want to go ahead and look ahead a little bit at the next few games, I mean, Washington looked like a totally different team facing Iowa than they did whenever they beat Michigan before. And I know Washington's going to have a chance to regroup. They're on their bye, or at least one of their byes this week before they travel to Indiana after that. But that Washington game, very winnable. And then I do think, when I talked about this with Alec Lasley last week or the week before, I don't really remember. I believe it might have been last week. But for some reason, the Michigan State game on the road does gives me some bad vibes, at least right now in the here and now. Maybe I'll change my mind here in a few weeks, but that's the first kind of road environment that may be a little more real for Indiana than the first two road games they've been on this year. Because yeah, you go out to the Rose Bowl and it was UCLA's first home game. And yeah, that was a road environment. But the Rose Bowl with UCLA is not quite your stereotypical rowdy home atmosphere for not even just a Big Ten team, but a power program in general. It's more about the location more so than the environment that the fans produce at the UCLA, if that makes sense. And then your second road game, you traveled to Northwestern, where they're not even playing in their real stadium. I mean, I guess it's a real stadium, but it's not where they're going to be permanently after next season. And not only that, you not only that, but you probably outnumbered Northwestern fans whenever you face them on the road, just because of the high number of Indiana alum in the Chicago area. So this Michigan State game in a few weeks is, in my opinion, I mean, I hate to say it's the first real road test because that kind of discredits the other road wins you got, but it's just that next level of road environment. And if they get put in a situation where maybe their back's against the wall late in the second half, which we've also not seen, Indiana's not put themselves in a lot of positions this year where you have to worry about, what comes next, because they always respond whenever they get put even in the slightest bit of adversity, I guess, if you will. So we'll talk more about that, of course, when we get to that game. Just kind of going through the back half, that's the schedule. And then after that, of course, you got Michigan at home. I think that's as winnable of a game as the rest as well, because I don't think Michigan is – I don't think they're a bad team. They're just not what people thought they were going to be. And that's very clear based on their two losses already to USC – or not USC, to Washington and Texas. And then after that, you got your second bye week. You got Ohio State on the road, and you finish off things with Purdue. And at that point, I mean, who knows what kind of record we're looking at for Indiana. It could be something that has never been done in the history of this program, or maybe it ends up being a solid yet somewhat disappointing, 8-4, or even I don't think you could. We're talking records here for just a moment. I think at this point, if Indiana finishes out the season 2-4, I don't think you say the season as a whole would be a failure. I do think you would say that the back half would be a disappointment because of the opportunity that was in front of you. So if you end up being like 8-4, yeah, there's some disappointment there for sure. But big picture, I don't think there's a lot of disappointment. But anything past that, 9-10 plus wins for Indiana, I think you could say success all the way. Because if you go 3-3 in this back half for a 9-3 record, that more than likely means you got wins against Purdue, let's say Michigan State, and then one between Nebraska and really, you don't even have to say Michigan State. You can say one of or two of the three between Nebraska, Washington, and Michigan State, or even Michigan. Honestly, they're all kind of on that same level, really, if I'm being honest. So I know I'm kind of getting into the weeds of the schedule and nerding out a little bit on that type of stuff. So I'll drop it right there. Last thing I'll mention, and then we'll get into our segment with Mitchell Paige. Indiana did climb up 2 spots in the AP poll without playing a game this weekend. They are now up to number 16 and also moved up a couple of spots in the coaches poll. They moved up to number 18 in that poll. But Indiana squarely, as we've talked about, in the conversation for getting into that, that 12-team playoff if they continue to win. When you look at all of the unbeatens in the AP poll and where they're ranked, man, I'll tell you what, ESPN is being a little annoying with some pop-up ads because I'm sitting here trying to reference some stuff and they're, getting in my way. Anyway, but here's all the unbeatens that are currently in the top 25 and where they rank. And we'll just take a look. We'll go from 25 to 1. One thing that's very interesting is the way that 2 of the 3 service academies are having outstanding seasons right now. And both of those, or 2 of the 3, like I said, Navy and Army have now found themselves both ranked. Navy at number 25 and Army at number 23. I mean, I'm thinking about this week doing a service academy parlay just with those 2 teams alone. They don't face each other, but with the teams that they do face, I think I talked with Dylan Sin about this last week too, a little bit. I think both of these teams could be on a collision course for each other. They may not go completely undefeated, but there is a chance that one of them could. And heck, maybe even one of them, with them being in the American Athletic Conference, maybe you find Army or Navy in the college football playoff potentially as the G5 representative. So that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. But they're 5-0 and 6-0 respectively. Pittsburgh comes in at number 20, ranked, with their 6-0 record. What a bounce back season from them as well, considering how low they were on the totem pole in the ACC last year. Of course, you got Indiana at 16, as I already mentioned. BYU, who hosted Big Noon Kickoff this past weekend, they are number 13, also 6-0. Iowa State, the Cyclones, also at 6-0. They are number 9. And one thing interesting about Iowa State, I know they didn't have as big of a drop-off as Indiana did the last couple of seasons, but I do remember Iowa State being a really big competitor the last time Indiana was also kind of vying for a potential playoff spot during the 2020 season. So it's interesting that both Indiana and Iowa State are having really good seasons so far. And then the other 4, there's still 4 unbeatens I haven't mentioned. Number 6, Miami, they will travel to the aforementioned Louisville team that I mentioned earlier. They will travel to Louisville this weekend and try to hold up their unbeaten record against the Cardinals. And then the top 3 teams, all undefeated. Number 3, Penn State. Number 2, Oregon, who got a massive win against Ohio State at home this past weekend. And then number 1, Texas, who absolutely throttled Oklahoma in the Red River rivalry, this past weekend as well. So there you have it, right? I mean, to be honest, I feel like there's a lot of unbeatens left for this, to be this far into the season already. Maybe I'm wrong, because there's been a lot of parity in college football, especially when I know there was specifically last week, there was a lot of parity, but I do feel like it is less obvious who the true competitors are, or maybe I'm just blowing smoke up my own behind whenever I say that. But, I mean, we know that Texas is really competitive near the top. Oregon, Penn State, and Ohio State. That feels like it's a fairly definitive top 4. And one thing that's crazy is outside of Texas, who's the second best team in the SEC? Is it Alabama? Is it Georgia? I mean, Alabama already beat Georgia, so you feel like that argument would be Alabama easily, but they had that silly loss to Vanderbilt. And speaking of Vanderbilt, they doubled down on their win this past weekend and beat Kentucky on the road. Now, I believe that says more about Mark Stoops in Kentucky more so than it does Vanderbilt, because I've been saying, not so much on this show, but on the show that I'm am a part of in the afternoons, I think Mark Stoops is kind of a bum, more so of a bum than he used to be. And I know he got a big win against Ole Miss, but I think overall Mark Stoops isn't as good of a head coach for Kentucky as he was in the early going. And I think maybe his days could be numbered, especially if they keep taking dumb losses like they did this past weekend. So we'll go ahead and put the football talk to bed for. Actually, I do have one more thing I want to mention. I'm sorry. I feel like I keep delaying Mitchell Paige, but I want to go ahead and mention this before I don't want to forget it later on. I guess I wouldn't, because I've got a mental note of it right now. But there was a former, it was either a former or a current UNC, North Carolina player who passed away this weekend from lung cancer. And one thing I really wanted to mention about this, because obviously I wasn't following this story and I don't follow North Carolina football, but it's just, when you see things like this, it's just really sad, because especially for me now, somebody who's, and I know I'm not old by any means, but now that I'm older than these players that are playing in college football, for the most part, there are some, 7th or 8th year seniors that feel like they're 30. But now that I'm pretty much older than all of the players that are in college football, when you see any of them and you hear they passed away from something, whether it be a tragedy or an illness or something like that, it's just a sad thing to think about, because you're like, wow, this person probably had a ton of life left to live. And unfortunately, they were given a circumstance that was just unfortunate for them. And they ended up not being able to, continue on with their life, and they passed away. So just wanted to offer thoughts and prayers up to the North Carolina player who passed away of lung cancer. Let me see if I can find his name real quick. And again, not that North Carolina, not that their family or fans or whatever going to be seeking out an Indiana football show to hear something like this, but I did want to at least mention, Tylee Kraft. He passed away, and he was 23 years old, and, just offering thoughts and prayers up to him and his family, because that is a very sad situation. So don't mean to end this opening little segment. And I say little segment, we've been going for nearly 23 minutes now to get the show started here on a Monday, but don't mean to end on a sad note, but I did want to go ahead and bring that up. I didn't want to ignore it, just because I did come across that this weekend and wanted to mention that on the show. So without further ado, though, we'll continue the good vibes with some Indiana football with Mitchell Paige here, as we continue to preview this weekend's matchup between the Hoosiers and the Cornhuskers. It is a Monday once again, and that means Mitchell Paige is with us, even though there was no Indiana football to consume this weekend. There was other football to consume, and we'll talk Indiana, of course, but I do want to start off welcoming in Mitchell, asking him how he enjoyed his bye week.
Yeah, usually on a bye week. Well, thank you. I guess I should start with thanks for having me on again, John. It's always a pleasure. Usually on a bye week, I wouldn't even turn on the TV. And because our squad is good, I'm watching every other team, seeing how is Indiana going to beat these guys in the college football playoff. So I watched a lot of football.
It is definitely, a different world that we're living in now, at least from the Indiana perspective, where it does feel like now that we're about to enter the back half of the season, there is so much that we are paying attention to, as you mentioned, that not that we wouldn't necessarily pay attention to it in seasons past, but there's a new level of interest, because there is that possibility of, okay, maybe we do meet one of these teams down the road in the postseason.
Yeah, I'm dissecting it like I'm a GA for the actual team, just making my notes when we get our name called inevitably, and I think it is inevitable. We'll find out a little bit more, but yeah, it's been good. And I think it's, you watch other teams and you watch how hard it is to just win, and I think we've talked about this a lot. I don't care who you're playing. It's just hard to win. And thinking about Indiana and their schedule or whatever, the way in which they're winning and doing it repeatedly, it just reminds me how, I mean, it's impressive. You cannot say that it's not impressive. Because I'm watching these top ranked teams struggle with stinky teams every single week. So beating a team by 30 points is not easy, right? It's not easy, and Indiana just continues to do that. So,
And I got to say, I love seeing every team that faces, and maybe not every team, but I love seeing many of the middle tier Big Ten teams that face UCLA, for example, struggle to beat them on the road. Whereas Minnesota did become the second Big Ten team, I believe, to get a road win on an opposite coastline, because neither of the West Coast teams or the East Coast teams now, except for Indiana or Minnesota, have been able to get a road win in those environments.
yeah, it's hard to do. It's hard. Minnesota had just beaten USC, who gave now the number 3 team in the country everything they wanted and more in Penn State. And they go out to play UCLA. I don't care that it's a different game, it's a different week, it's the same team. And they're in a dogfight. A dogfight for 4 quarters. Indiana hasn't been in a dogfight for more than 10 minutes.
That's true. They've never trailed. I know we talked about the stat where, at least I know I mentioned this. I don't know if you and I talked about it, where in the first quarter, Indiana's not allowed anybody to score. And I think they've scored 73 points. And then the fourth quarter, I think it's like 80 something to 13. I don't have the number right in front of me, but it just shows that Cignetti gets his guys prepped. And I do want to throw this. I did a little, I guess it's kind of research. It's unofficial research, if you will. One thing people like to throw out is, what is a coach's record coming off of a bye week? And for Curt Cignetti specifically, I couldn't find anything that was prior to him being an Elon. So Elon up until this year, of course, is what I was able to look through. And there's also a couple of extra bye weeks that I included where there was like COVID postponements where they had to have a week off that they weren't expecting. And then also I included, there were like, whenever he was at the FCS level, there were times before the playoffs where you would have a week in between. I think that only happened once before the playoffs. But Cignetti's record from Elon until now, after the bye week, actually, I want to ask you, Mitchell, what do you think it is? There's 11 games on here. What do you think is Curt Cignetti's record coming off of a bye?
Just based on the way that his teams have been prepared without a bye, I would guess 10-1 or better.
10-1, absolutely. Yeah. That one loss being in 2022 to the Louisville Cardinals. And I don't remember exactly what I saw the score was of that game, but 10-1. And I don't think that's really a super surprising stat to most people, considering every other stat that we talk about with Cignetti and his win-loss record is usually very positive. So fans worried about maybe how this team may look coming off of an off week, I would say trying to put your worries aside as Nebraska comes to town.
Yeah, I can't wait, dude. I got my tickets this morning already. We got an Airbnb. We will be there.
It is an announced sellout.
Early and often. I know a bunch of former players that are going back. Homecoming obviously helps, but place is going to be buzzing. Got Big Noon Kickoff coming in. We got the Barstool boys coming in.
I didn't know Barstool was going to be there. So two of the, I guess, pre-football, whatever you want to call them. Obviously, it's not game day, but heck, I'll even say this. Even though it doesn't have the brand recognition of an ESPN College Game Day, I think the product that Fox puts out is a lot more polished and enjoyable to consume than ESPN's version.
We'll agree to disagree.
That's fine. We can disagree with it. Yeah.
It's definitely more polished. It's a bunch of professionals up there. I'm just not sure that it's more fun to watch. But it's a huge show. They go to the biggest games every week, and they're coming to Bloomington. And then you got Dave Portnoy and Big Cat and the boys hosting their show there too. It's just going to be an insane weekend. I can't even barely contain my excitement.
And I'll say, and maybe we've said this every week, to be honest, this is another one of those games where not only is this kind of it's not your first time in front of a national audience, but it's the first time where the national audience is really paying attention to you.
Mm-hmm.
So if you win this game and you continue to do it in the convincing fashion that you have every other time you've taken the field this season, that elevates, excuse me, your expectations to another level. I don't want to necessarily say the ceiling has been raised because I think we already kind of know at this point what the ceiling is. It's just sometimes it's hard to accept that maybe the ceiling truly is an 11-1 type regular season. And I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I'm quite ready to say that they would beat Ohio State on the road because no matter who you are, that's going to be a tough environment. But to fully realize that this team could potentially find their way to a 10-11 win type season before you even get to postseason play. This is just the next step in that direction, and it continues to affirm all the beliefs that could be the case.
Yeah, I think opposing teams have already realized it. They've already figured it out. We're not sneaking up on anybody. I think people that actually watch the games and understand what we're trying to do and why we're so effective understand. Now there's this national audience or people that aren't like really watching that you've got to quote unquote convince. And this is going to be a huge step towards that. And I think the danger, and I doesn't seem to have been a problem yet, but Kurt Signetti's teams, everybody that they interview, every player talks about the chip on their shoulder, proving ourselves, prove the haters wrong, whatever. You go out there and smoke Nebraska, everybody's going to start talking about, and I've seen it already a couple times, the feel-good story of Indiana. Almost like it's not a real thing. It's nice that they're winning. Everybody's cheering for them. Yippee kind of deal.
Just like in 2020. That's how that was.
Yeah. Versus this Indiana team is for real. They're physical, they're fast, and they're going to punch somebody in the mouth. And I don't think opposing teams will be thinking anything but we better get ready. Because if they don't, they're going to get run over. But we're going to have to prepare ourselves for the, oh my gosh, Indiana's so nice to watch. And that can be infectious to the players. So new challenges arise after this week. But I think we talked about it. Did you see the spread's only 5 points?
So it started off at the beginning of last week at 3.5, and I'm looking at it right now in front of me, and I'm just looking. This is how it's evolved via, I believe, ESPN spreads. They have their own betting sports book, but it's currently sitting at 6.5 that I can see.
Is it already up to 6.5?
Yeah.
I got it at 5 yesterday. I told you I would have taken them like 12.5, I think was the number that I said.
I hate to say that. That's not me saying that they'll win by 14, but I think this team has the ability to beat Nebraska by 2 scores if they play to their strengths.
That's not
maybe
enough.
More than that.
Yeah. If Indiana plays to their strengths, this is a 4 touchdown kind of game because they're going to be able to heat up the quarterback, and the quarterback has already shown that he ain't about it just yet. If you let him stand there, he'll spit it everywhere. But if you get in his face, you're hitting him, you're knocking him down. That offense just kind of sputters. They don't.
I mean, they struggle to put up points against Rutgers, who got completely throttled by Wisconsin this weekend, which that was, for those who follow along with my betting picks on this show, this was not a good week to do so because I took Rutgers minus 2.5. That was not a good week for me, or a good pick for me. But I know Indiana's defense has shown vulnerability at times. I do think there will probably be some moments this weekend where Raiola is able to make a couple of good plays and maybe put Indiana on their toes a little bit. Mm-hmm. But anytime we've seen the Hoosiers in those types of positions, they've always responded. So continuing to do so will be, I mean, really just the challenge. Continue to be what you've already been, which is kind of weird saying that. This is usually not what we're saying at this point in the season for any Indiana football team. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah. It feels like they need to do exactly what they're doing, which is maybe the game is a touchdown or a 10-point game at halftime. Nebraska's got to start throwing the ball around, and that's when Indiana's D-line heats up, and that's when they really start causing havoc. So I expect it to be close and fun to watch in the first half. Stay in the stands, fans.
Yeah,
It's a
this will
sellout.
be a good case study with the sold out game and, a game in which you're favored and have a chance to prove things to a national audience once again. Can the fans be in that same mindset? Because we know what they do for a big Indiana basketball game. They're going to be there from before start till after the finish. Will that be the case for the Memorial Stadium crowd this weekend?
Yeah. And being on Fox, it's a big game on Fox. It's a chance to start chipping away at the narrative about IU fans. So stay in the stands. But it just feels like a kind of a slow churn type game. I think that Indiana's just going to kind of lean on Nebraska. They don't run it particularly well. I think they play really good on defense. So my guess is it's going to take some time to unlock what they're doing on defense. And you're going to have to just slowly but surely build a lead. And once you build a lead with an offense that doesn't click really, and maybe this is the week they do, who knows? But Nebraska has not done so up to this point. Once you start to gain a little lead, mistakes start happening, and then you get good field position. Things start flipping on their head, and it feels kind of like a waterfall. That's the kind of game that I anticipate, just because Nebraska is tough on defense.
This kind of feels like for Indiana, if you can surpass the 28-point mark, which they've done every game this season, it feels like that kind of guarantees you victory in this type of game.
Yeah, it doesn't. I just don't see. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see 4 touchdowns out of the Nebraska offense. I've watched them, I guess, only a couple times. I haven't watched every snap, but the freshman quarterback is going to be good. But the same thing that's happening at Tennessee right now with Nico Iamaleava, it's just not crisp. He's had guys running them wide open, and as you get heated up, your internal clock starts going faster, and you just start missing throws. And I think that Raiola has been a victim of that as well. So Indiana, I think the biggest key to the game is putting pressure on the quarterback, establishing the offensive and defensive line, and then everything else kind of takes care of itself. You put pressure on the quarterback, establish the line of scrimmage, the big plays come, wide receivers will start to make things happen. I think we've talked about it. You've got a wide receiver core that I would argue is second or third best in the top 2 or 3, I guess. Some people maybe argue best in the country, don't have the best player, or not in the country, in the conference. I think that other teams have better individual players, but across the board, guys that can go get you a first down, they're definitely in the top echelon of the conference. So you allow those guys to start getting in a rhythm, making plays as you establish the line of scrimmage and as you start to get better field position because you're playing good defense. They're just playing really good complementary ball, and you said it exactly. Do exactly what we've been doing, establish lines of scrimmage, and put pressure on the quarterback.
So funny how I mentioned it feels like at least 28 points would be the key here. So I'm looking at Nebraska's scores, and every game that didn't involve playing against an FCS or a G5 opponent, they played 4 of those games, correct? Colorado, Illinois, Purdue, and Rutgers. They've not found a way past that 28-point mark. 28 points against Colorado, 24 in overtime against Illinois, 28 against Purdue, and then only 14 against Rutgers. So I do feel like that's
28
probably
against Colorado.
Yeah. So they got a big on them early and they didn't put the pedal to the metal against them. I believe that is how that game worked.
That's what I'm saying. They felt like they smoked them. And
they did. It was 28-10. But I do think
but that's not
that's
definitely not indicative. That I think that kind of further proves your point, as you're saying, that this is not a high volume, high scoring offense. They make their hay on defense. They're going to try to suffocate you, and
it very much could be. And if Nebraska does find a way to get past kind of that 4 touchdown mark, then at that point we probably have to talk more seriously about Indiana having defensive issues, and hopefully that ends up not being the case. Indiana may win this game 42-39 for all we know, or maybe they lose it 42-39. We'll see. But
No.
Any closing thoughts for as we move into this? I mean, it's a big homecoming week in general. You got Hoosier Hysteria on Friday for basketball, which is crazy. Hoosier Hysteria is going to take place before Indiana football has suffered any loss, which is obviously never happened before.
Yeah, I just cannot imagine the environment. That's all I'm thinking about. There was even a buzz for Maryland that there hadn't been in a long time just walking into the stadium. People are excited. I can't imagine what it's going to be on Saturday. I just can't wait. I'm pumped.
And I'm very upset that I won't be in attendance because of the Louisville-Miami game also being at noon. But in consolation, I am looking forward to just watching on big noon kickoff to see what the environment is like from the TV standpoint. And hopefully it makes me jealous, because if it doesn't make me jealous, then that means people didn't show out for it, which they will, though. I know they will.
Yeah, I'll send you pictures.
Okay. Mitchell, appreciate you as always, and hopefully we're talking about a 7-0 Indiana team next Monday.
That's the plan. I fully expect it.
Big thank you, as always, to Mitchell Paige for taking the time to chat all things football with us. And I do hope we are going to be talking about a 7-0 Indiana football team, because that just adds to the excitement week after week. And again, when you collide it all with basketball season, it could be a very electric time in Bloomington. And maybe that sounds corny, but I hope that ends up being the case, especially the first year for me. And I'm not, this is probably sounding like I'm making it all about me, but it is fun for this to be the first year of me doing a show like this semi full time. And then the reason I even say semi is because it's not a daily show. It is something I do 3 times a week plus the post game shows. But for this to be the first year that I'm kind of tracking the teams and seeing the level of success with football, especially whenever I've talked about this before with the podcasts and review shows I've done for Indiana football with people like Dustin and Mitchell. Those teams were terrible, and it was not fun to talk about those teams week in and week out. And it was for shows shorter than this. So I couldn't imagine trying to talk about an Indiana football team that was terrible for an extended period of time on a regular basis. So I'm very glad that's not the case. Couple more quick football hitters before we move on to do some basketball stuff here in the back half of the show. Kirk Ferentz from Iowa got his 200th win as a head coach this past weekend. And Kirk Ferentz is like one of the only, we've talked before about kind of the old guard of basketball coaches kind of slowly shifting their way out of the scene. And we've seen the same thing in college football too. But Kirk Ferentz, I mean, if you look at the Iowa football program in general, I don't know, did I just say program or like grand with an N? Oh, well, it doesn't matter. The Iowa football program in the last, 30 or 40 years has had 2 head coaches, Hayden Fry and Kirk Ferentz, and they both were there for, it seems like, ages. And it just makes you think, who are they going to move on to whenever Kirk Ferentz finally decides to hang it up? And I've thrown out the idea that maybe if Mark Stoops overstays his welcome, I should say, at Kentucky, with Mark Stoops being an Iowa alum and him kind of running that same gritty defensive style of football that Iowa is used to, it wouldn't surprise me one bit if Mark Stoops ends up finding his way to Iowa City in the next few years if Ferentz retires. But again, that remains to be seen. Well, hopefully we'll have Jeffrey the Greek on this week too. Haven't talked with him just yet, but going to work on trying to set something up with him this week, as we do every few weeks, to get his thoughts on Big Ten football, him being an Iowa alum himself. So maybe I can get his thoughts on maybe that specifically, what will happen when Kirk Ferentz inevitably retires down the road. Another thing that was cool this weekend, did any of you see the Bowling Green Falcons kid-designed football helmets? And this is a very unique thing. There's a chance. It'd be cool if you saw programs do something like this in the future. But I'll go ahead and I'll show let me show this real quick, just so I can give you all a visual. Let me share my screen. So this is what the Bowling Green Falcons football team wore on the field this past weekend for their game against Northern Illinois. And there were 2 winners, someone named Tegan, someone named Ida. I think they were 12 and 13 years old, if I remember seeing that correctly. these were the logos that were put on the helmets for the Falcons this weekend as they took on the Huskies of Northern Illinois. So really cool little thing that maybe you'll see different, unique things like that, kind of promotional little things that get, younger fans involved. And I think that's cool to see, especially like that's something maybe they won't remember for the rest of their life, but maybe they will. I mean, they'll probably never wear these helmets again, I wouldn't think, but it's still cool, especially if you are like, I'm sure both of these kids are, they have some sort of tie to the university, whether it be a family member or, maybe they have a sibling on the team or something like that. Who knows? Maybe it's not those two things specifically, but just wanted to throw those ideas out there. All right. I know I've done a lot of football blabbering, and I know a lot of you, and myself included, are excited for basketball season. And the unofficial tip-off with that is Hoosier Hysteria that will, at least for Indiana, that will take place this upcoming Friday, leading up to the homecoming game against Nebraska on Saturday. And a few of the other local teams have already had their Midnight Madness events. And when I say local teams, for me, being down here in Mount Washington, Kentucky, I'm referring to Louisville and UK. Louisville had their Louisville Live event, which is, again, their iteration of Midnight Madness. UK had Big Blue Madness. And I'm sure some of you have seen this because this was a national story this weekend, I feel like, at least on social media. Rick Pitino making an appearance at Big Blue Madness is it's odd, but it's also like not shocking at all, because even though Rick Pitino is currently the head coach at St. John's, he has ties to the university, he has ties to Kentucky's new head coach. And it's still just very strange, though, to see him be able to just kind of waltz his way over to Lexington and St. John's not really be able to do anything about him wanting to go and see his former players. Because for those who don't know, Mark Pope, Kentucky's new head coach, was a former captain for Rick Pitino whenever he was at Kentucky, whenever they won one of his national championships. So I understand from that perspective why he went down there, but at the same time, he shows up in Kentucky blue gear, again, while he's a head coach for St. John's. And again, like, there's probably nothing that St. John's could have even done to prevent him from doing something like that. I mean, I guess they technically could, but Rick Pitino would have done it anyway, because that's just who Rick Pitino probably is. I don't mean to assume, but I mean, he's a larger than life figure when it comes to college basketball head coaches. And it's just very interesting. I mean, 10 years ago, right, he was still the head coach at Louisville. And I don't want to say he hated Kentucky, because I don't think he ever hated Kentucky, but he definitely hated John Calipari during his time whenever he was the head coach at Louisville. And that rivalry was so heated. And, I won't blabber on too much longer about that, but just wanted to bring that up just because to me, it was a national story. Maybe Indiana fans don't care, but I mean, here's the thing. I know Indiana fans hate Kentucky, and I am one of those. I have learned to live with Kentucky fans. I mean, I've lived down here now for, heck, I can't give you the exact amount of years. I guess close to over 15 years I lived in Kentucky at this point, that's even crazy to think about for me, because I don't think I've said that out loud. I grew up in Indiana. Anyway, living down here that long, yeah, it sucked for a while, especially as a kid. You're always around Kentucky fans. U of L fans, not so much. And not that they couldn't give me a hard time every once in a while, but UK fans loved to give me a hard time whenever I was in school. And that was fine. There were times when I got to rub it in their face. Like, I remember, and I won't talk about this for too long either, because I know this is overplayed and overdone, but I remember just shoving it in everybody's face whenever Christian Watford hit his shot back in 2011, whenever it was. But again, that was delivered right back to me later on in the NCAA tournament when Kentucky ended up avenging that loss 102-90, whatever it was, and ended up going on to win the national championship that year. So, and I think that result in and of itself, it does kind of make it seem like nonsense why Indiana kept celebrating that shot year in and year out, especially because Indiana never fully returned to prominence after that shot. Yeah, they had their moments. The following year, they were awesome. They were a number 1 seed in the tournament before you end up losing to Syracuse. But then you dropped off after that. And you eventually, won the Big Ten again in 16 with Yogi Ferrell and the crew. But I am glad that I feel like for the most part, fans have moved on past the Watt shot being like some sort of iconic thing. And again, not trying to take away from what Christian Watford did, but I'm just glad that fans don't obsess over that shot for the most part. I know that there are some, like I know, for example, when the Hoosier Hysterics kind of recreated that shot at one of their events a year or so ago, whenever it was, that was pretty cringeworthy, for being honest. But you just wanted to mention that. So, with that being said, Hoosier Hysteria details. Let's go over a couple of these real quick. So, again, for the uneducated, and again, if there's anything I missed here, you can check any of this out on Kyler. On Kyler Staley's write-up on HoosierIllustrated.com. He's got a full release on everything that was announced when it comes to what's going to happen at Hoosier Hysteria this Friday. So it will take place at 7:30 p.m. at, of course, Simon Scott Assembly Hall. Doors are at 6:30, free admission. But for those who have been to this event before, you know that they typically encourage people coming to donate to the Hoosier Hills Food Bank with non-perishable food items. This is something they've done for a very long time. And it's usually, at least according to this, one of their biggest donation drives of the year. So, but leading up to Hoosier Hysteria will be the homecoming parade at 5:30, and the parade will conclude with a fireworks show over Simon Scott Assembly Hall. And once 7:30 comes around, you'll have the head coaches and player introductions. Both Woodson and Morin will address the crowds after some special performances by both the Indiana cheerleaders and the Red Steppers. And then you'll have your typical skill competitions between both the men's and the women's teams. And Indiana alum Trisha Whitaker is going to be the MC of the event. And as far as I can tell, there's not going to be any musical acts. I know last year, or maybe in the year before, I don't remember exactly, or maybe it was both. They had a musical performance after the fact. I believe it was G Herbo. And if I'm saying that wrong, I probably just sounded really stupid. But I know there was someone along the lines of that name performed at Hoosier Hysteria. And maybe they have a surprise special guest for something like that potentially. But if you're unable to attend Hoosier Hysteria, the event is going to be, and I believe I mentioned this last week, it's going to be on Big Ten Plus. And that is something that you do need to pay for. And I don't know if it's something that comes with a package. Like, for example, I know like with my Hulu package, I get ESPN Plus for free along with a few other things. There may be some sort of Fox package that's similar. I don't know. And maybe I even have that. I need to check myself because, and I'm sure usually these types of subscription services allow you to do a free trial. So if you are somebody who wants to see Hoosier Hysteria live as it takes place, you will need to watch it on Big Ten Plus unless you're able to attend in person at Simon Scott Assembly Hall. And let's see. I'm looking at this too. This is from Kyler. So a season pass will get you, which is $89.99, and a monthly pass is $12.99 for Big Ten Plus. And he also goes on to mention that there are going to be 2 other times this season where you will have to watch the men's basketball team on Big Ten Plus, and there'll be 13 women's games hosted on Big Ten Plus. So if you're somebody who knows you want to consume every ounce of Indiana basketball, then maybe it would be a good investment to get on one of those, not one of them, but get on the, subscribe either to the monthly or the yearly. And I'm not advertising for Big Ten Plus, obviously. Just wanted to mention that up in case for those who were wondering if it may be worth your time to invest in a little bit of money to see it. I'm hoping I already have something that includes Big Ten Plus. I'm going to assume I don't, though, but I'm going to be checking later on this week because I do want to find a way to check that out, of course. So there's your Hoosier Hysteria details. And we'll have some boots on the ground there, of course, this Friday. I believe Kyler will be in attendance. I don't know that for a fact. So if I'm wrong, and Kyler, you're listening, I apologize. But I do think you mentioned you're going to be there. Let's see. Let's go ahead and get into one other thing before we wrap this up today. And it is basketball related. I promise that wasn't the only basketball talk that I had today. For those of you who are fiending for basketball. But there is something that came out last night that is probably of interest, especially to all the diehards of college basketball. And that is the initial 2024-2025 KenPom ratings. And I know KenPom is not the definitive statistical platform, if you will, that people use to, kind of navigate figuring out what your team looks like for the year, the type of thing. You have the net ratings. There's so many different ones. I know that they used to have the RPI. That's not really something people go by anymore. I know the net is what is highly used to rate your teams for the NCAA tournament, but KenPom, I'm looking right now at a screenshot courtesy of Jack Grossman. We'll go and shout him out because I wouldn't have this otherwise, because I do believe you have to be subscribed to KenPom to see this otherwise. But he screenshotted it's a picture of the projected Big Ten standings according to KenPom, and it also has got a list of the most powerful conferences. This is all preseason, of course. But this is a little kind of shocking, I would say, based on what we've talked about when it comes to Indiana expectations. And I'll say this, KenPom is not very high on Indiana when it comes to them. Maybe nationally it might not seem terrible. And actually, we'll start there real quick before I get into the specifics of the Big Ten, I guess. But Jack Grossman put this out again. Just give him credit for it, because, again, I don't have access to this. But Indiana is currently nationally ranked, according to KenPom, as the 39th best team in the country. And with most people, prior to that, mentioning that Indiana is likely a top 15, top 20 team, that's surprising. And then you take this a step further by looking at their projected Big Ten finish. Purdue is 1, Illinois is 2, UCLA is 3, Oregon 4, Ohio State 5, Iowa 6, Michigan State 7, 8, Michigan, Maryland 9. Indiana slides in all the way, projected at 10th out of 18 teams in the KenPom, projecting their conference record to be, and some of you may have guessed it, because this is very similar to what we've seen in Indiana years past, and that's a 10-10 conference record, which I feel like that would be very unacceptable on almost every front when it comes to this year. But I will say this. I do think, not every formula is perfect, of course. We talked about the FPI with football and how, I know they're very high on Indiana, and so far they've been pretty correct about that. But this is the first kind of preseason metric or prediction, if you will, that's not super excited about Indiana basketball and what they brought in. So, and again, this will change, but it's definitely something to, keep an eye on. I mean, they have them at the top of the bottom half of the Big Ten standings. One other thing that I believe surprised some people when it comes to this Big Ten conference prediction is Rutgers being picked second to last, 17th. And also, I've talked about not really taking much into consideration with preseason polls and that type of thing. We all know Indiana football was projected second to last for Big Ten football, and look where they're at right now. That's obviously not the case. But it is interesting how there is now a metric that doesn't really think Indiana is as good as many people see them at right now going into the season. And then one other thing I want to mention too, this is, and it only shows the top 4 on the screenshot. It's the strongest conferences going into the season. Number 4 is the Big East. Number 3 is the Big 10. Number 2 is the Big 12. And number 1, the mighty SEC. And I hope that ends up not being the case. It already feels like them being the top dog in the football year in and year out is a lot to handle when it comes to just the talking heads. I hope that ends up not being the case for basketball this season as well. It usually isn't, but just wanted to go ahead and throw that out there. So one last sip of coffee as we wrap up today's episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports. Thank you for sticking around. Hope you enjoyed it. Looking forward to doing it all again on Wednesday. And also don't forget to check out Talking About the Hoosiers on Thursday. Another In Touch with Indiana Sports on Friday. And we'll have some variation of the post-game wrap-up show on Saturday. Need to confirm what we're doing for that because obviously, as I've mentioned before, my schedule is very wonky with Louisville also playing at noon this weekend. So I would love to be able to do a post-game show still. But if I end up doing it, it is more than likely not going to be, I mean, it may still be able to be live, but it wouldn't be live immediately after the game ends. It would more than likely be a couple of hours after the game ends. And whether or not that's a big deal, I need to run that by the brass at HoosierIllustrated.com. I say that like they're, a bunch of hardheads. They're not. They're really good people to work with. And you should subscribe to us on YouTube as well. Check out everything we got going on the video side of things that I already mentioned, and check out all the good stuff being written on HoosierIllustrated.com as well by Kyler, Alec, Drew, Dylan, the whole gang. And they'll keep you covered on all things Indiana football, basketball, and beyond. So until Wednesday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.